Hello, college biology students. I'm going to finish the last little bit on this chapter, on movement through the cell membrane, and then we're going to be gearing up for a test this week. Okay, and I'll kind of look at what we have left and make a decision. It won't be on Wednesday, so I'm sure it'll be on Friday. So I'll find some other things to kind of work through in the interim. So we talked about passive transport and how things move through the cell membrane, and we said passive transport doesn't require energy, and things are moving from an area where they're more concentrated to an area where they're less concentrated. Like if you put a drop of food coloring in water, it's moving from an area where there's lots of food coloring to areas where there's none or very little until it's evenly diffused throughout. So with active transport, we are talking about things that require the use of energy. And when we talk about energy in the cell, we are talking about that magical adenosine triphosphate molecule that gives up its phosphates as like little battery packs that are going to power things, processes that require energy in the cell. So one of these is something called the sodium-potassium pump. If you are an athlete or someone who just does really hard physical work and you sweat a lot, drinking water is not enough to keep you hydrated. You actually need to replace those electrolytes. You know how when you sweat, like if you ever, like any of it drips into your mouth, you can taste that it's salty? Well, you're not losing just water when you sweat, you're losing a lot of things. And some of those things are that sodium ions, potassium ions, and other ions that we classify as electrolytes. And it's really important to replace those because there's a very delicate balance in cells that has to be maintained of those levels of electrolytes. Straight up, your cells don't work well if they don't have enough sodium, or they don't have enough potassium, or they have too much. So that's one aspect of maintaining homeostasis in the cells, is maintaining those levels of sodium and potassium. So there's a sodium-potassium pump, which is a membrane protein that has a very, very specific, it's a carrier protein that has a very specific job. And it is for moving sodium and potassium ions through that cell membrane to maintain that balance. So moving sodium ions in or out and moving potassium ions in. There has to be a balance. And a lot of times it's moving these against the concentration gradient, so it requires energy. And then moving large particles, there's a process called endocytosis and exocytosis. So this is a little visual of kind of what that looks like. So things like nutrition components, for example, might be something that really need to move through the cell membrane, but they're very large. And the cell membrane is like, there's no way that is fitting through, and maybe it doesn't even have, the right charges and whatever, but they're usually very large particles that can't just diffuse through and maybe can't even fit through those membrane proteins because they're very big. So endocytosis is taking those large particles in. The cell membrane itself makes a little dip, if you will. The particle kind of goes in here. Sometimes it's a liquid. We'll talk about that too. And then the cell membrane pinches off across here, kind of closes the door, if you will, and then closes that off, and it moves into the cell as a vesicle. So now this vesicle gets moved to wherever it needs to go for the cell to do its thing, and that might be cellular respiration, where it's breaking that down into molecules that the cell can use for energy, and so on. Exocytosis, sometimes we have things that are made in the cell, like certain proteins that are made by the ribosomes. They move through that endoplasmic reticulum to the Golgi apparatus, where they get packaged up into vesicles. and then this vesicle moves to the cell membrane. It fuses with the cell membrane, and once it's fused, the cell opens that membrane or opens the door and lets it out. Maybe these are proteins that need to build a structure on the outside of the cell or something. So that's a quick overview of endocytosis versus exocytosis. So endocytosis means, endo means into, or I'm going to say enter the cell. So endo means into, it brings stuff into the cell. And we can further break that down into whether we think it is liquid or solid, food particle. So penocytosis indicates that it's a liquid coming in. So we might call this cell drinking, where phagocytosis is cell eating. And those are the two ways that we can bring things into the cell. These are larger particles. This requires ATP. This is active transport. Exocytosis then is movement of large particles out of the cell. And again, a lot of times these are proteins that are made in the cell that now need to go out and do jobs outside of the cell. So exocytosis is exiting the cell. So exo, exit. That's the way I remember it. And as we talk about all of these things that move through the cell membrane, super important to remember this homeostasis. So homeostasis is all about maintaining internal conditions. And we talk about this, earlier on. We talk about this in terms of, we need to regulate oxygen levels in the body. We need to regulate body temperature. We need to regulate the pH in certain parts of the body. All of this homeostasis really starts or finishes, if you will, but it takes place at the cellular level. It's all about what goes into and out of that cell membrane. So when we talk about regulating oxygen, for example, in our bodies, so we take oxygen into our lungs, it's not like our lungs need oxygen, okay? Why do we take oxygen into our lungs? So that it can get into the cells. So that homeostasis is all happening at that cellular membrane, and really that cell membrane, or at that cellular level, and that cell membrane is really kind of the policeman of it all, or police person of it all, because it controls what goes into and out of. So it's the ultimate regulator of, what's gonna get into and out of the cells, and then those processes that take place at the cellular level. And again, we can say that about oxygen levels. We can say that about glucose levels. We can say that, about so many of the things that we think of in terms of homeostasis in our bodies. So active and passive transport really maintain those constant internal conditions of fluids in the cells. And then the last thing I want to go over just as kind of a review is those different types of cell transport. I wrote a few notes down, so I want to look at those. So when we talk about we talk in terms of this big, idea of transport through the cell membrane, we can break this down into either passive or active. These are our two choices. It's either passive or active. And we said passive means without energy. Active happens with energy. Okay? And specifically, we said that energy piece is adenosine triphosphate. We can further break down the passive transport into, color. So passive transport could be diffusion. And diffusion, a couple of examples we gave was the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide. The other one is osmosis. That's the movement of water. And then the other one, too, is facilitated diffusion. So it's still diffusion, Still diffusion, but needs a little bit of help with the carrier protein that's going to facilitate that movement through the cell membrane. One more thing to add. Whenever we talk about passive, pick a different color, this one. Passive transport moves with the concentration gradient. That's why it can be passive and not require energy. Active transport, a lot of times it moves against that concentration gradient. So that's the difference. The types of, let me move my face out of the way. So active transport, we talked about a couple of different ones, actually 3 of them. We said endocytosis, which could be pinocytosis or phagocytosis. So cyto is Latin for cell. That's why we see this cyto this and cyto that. Exocytosis. And then the other one that we kind of mentioned was the sodium potassium pump. And that's really kind of an overview, kind of it in a nutshell. Hopefully that helps. I love concept maps because it just sort of, it gives you a nice visual to sort of organize it all. And that's really it for this unit. So hopefully this all makes sense to you.